Previously on the Cold War. For all of human history, if you wanted to ship something from South or East Asia on a boat to ports in Europe, you literally had to sail around the entirety of the continent of Africa, which is, needless to say, massive. After the Second World War, the canal would become even more important as it became a significant trade route for that all-governing commodity going into Europe: oil. By the 1950s, oil accounted for about half the traffic going through the canal, representing 2 out of every 3 barrels of oil used in Europe. Nasser wanted to have the entire Middle East as a part of Egypt's sphere of influence, so Nasser began negotiating a purchase of weapons from communist Czechoslovakia. Then, the final moments leading to the collapse were finally underway. Jordan, after British attempts to add them into their alliance, kicked the British out of their country. In July of 1956, Nasser announced the nationalization of the Suez Canal, and on his command, the Egyptian military seized it. 3 months later, representatives from France, Britain, and Israel met to draft a plan to invade Egypt and take the canal back by force. And now, with the pieces in play, we will see how this dramatic week unfolded, and the long-term impacts it had for the world. I'm your host David, and this is The Cold War. The plan had been set for the Anglo-Franco-Israeli invasion of Egypt to secure the Suez Canal, that seaway so essential for the flow of oil into Europe. Nasser closing the canal would wreak havoc across the European economy. So the three powers marshaled a massive strike to stop Egypt from controlling its own resources. For more on the details of the plan and blow-by-blow narrative, might I suggest the Suez video on our sister channel, Kings and Generals. On October 29th, the plan was set into motion. Israel invaded into the Sinai Peninsula through the Gaza Strip. The British and French focused on an aerial campaign based from aircraft carriers. On October 30th, the French and British gave Egypt an ultimatum, and the next day began a bombing campaign. Nasser responded by blocking the entire Suez Canal. What followed was a bloody conflict which lasted for 9 days. By its end, as many as 1,000 Egyptian civilians were killed, and a further 3,000 Egyptian soldiers. Israel claimed casualties in the range of 172 dead, the British 16, and the French 10. But a decisive military victory was not what brought this crisis to an end. It was political pressure. Around the world, the invaders took heavy criticism. The Suez Crisis took place at around the same time as the Hungarian Revolution, a subject for an upcoming video, to be sure. Because of that, the US couldn't condemn the Soviet invasion of Hungary, but then turn a blind eye to this invasion of Egypt. US President Dwight Eisenhower also feared a potential backlash, which might toss the Arab world into the hands of the USSR. I mean, Nasser had already bought weapons from Czechoslovakia, so it was a legitimate concern. In a move which looks utterly baffling by today's geopolitical situation, the US led a UN resolution asking Israel to pull troops out of Egypt, and the British and the French had to veto it. The Islamic world also took this as an attack against all of them, sparking protests as far away as Pakistan. Syria sabotaged Iraqi oil pipelines just for taking the British side in the conflict. On the first day of the invasion, the UK became horribly divided over it. On day one, a famous talk show lambasted the Tories for what they called a criminal invasion. The press coverage was so bad, the government considered taking over the BBC if it didn't get more pro-war. Something a tad ironic, as that popular talk show was called free speech. Now, keep in mind, this invasion also happened several months after the nationalization of the canal. Support for intervention was more of a thing when the British people didn't know whether the Egyptians would even be able to manage something like the Suez Canal. By the time of the invasion, it was clear that they could, and actually had been running the canal just fine. Even the military had a hard time accepting the government of Prime Minister Anthony Eden's arguments for invading Egypt. This heat led to a furious session of Parliament. Eden was compared to Hitler only 11 years after the end of the Second World War. The Labour Party led massive anti-war protests, one crowd even attempting to storm the Prime Minister's house at 10 Downing Street in what would be the most literal version of throwing someone out of power. But, according to historical records, Eden wasn't much moved by the opposition party, angry letters, or protests. Actually, historians disagree over whether the British people, by and large, supported Eden. It was divisive for sure, but how many fell on which side of the roof? Well, there's a compelling argument that it was split down the middle, or at least changed over time. What got him to back down from the invasion eventually was pressure from the United States. The British needed loans from the IMF to keep the invasion going, and the US blocked those attempts. The Eisenhower administration even considered selling some of their sterling bonds and went through with oil sanctions. This would have put the UK in a situation where it'd have trouble importing basic essentials like food. This translated into tensions at the United Nations. The Security Council called the first ever UN emergency session to pass a resolution calling for peace, which, as a Toronto-based operation here, we could not let pass without mentioning that Canadian diplomat Lester B. Pearson put significant effort into this process. So much so, in fact, that he won the Nobel Peace Prize for it, and then less than a decade later would become our Prime Minister. Just a fun bit of trivia there, Canada did have a surprising role to play as a sort of intermediary between the French, British, and Americans. It's how Canada gained a reputation as peacekeepers. Now, lastly, things got really hairy when the USSR threatened to get involved using missiles on the side of Egypt. They threatened to use the Soviet troops to stop the invasion, and people began to worry that the Cold War might actually turn hot over this massive political mess. This was far enough into the nuclear age that this would mean massive nuclear devastation across potentially the whole world. However, Khrushchev would later admit he was bluffing. The British called a ceasefire on November 6th very suddenly when they looked just a day from controlling the canal. Israel waited another few months to leave, and as a final dig, destroyed all of the infrastructure in the Sinai Peninsula. Okay, so that's the events. But what impact did all of this conflict have on the geopolitics of the region and the world? Well, first of all, the peace process solidified the Egyptian control of the Suez Canal. An unresolved peace between Egypt and Israel would boil over into the Six-Day War 11 years later, which will be a video or two on its own further down the line. Stay subscribed. The Western wartime alliance of France, the UK, and the US had a new wedge driven between them, while the USSR walked away in, well, decent shape. This was unquestionably a diplomatic loss for the Western allies of the Cold War. The USSR walked away with a few victories. The attention from the Suez Crisis gave the Soviets lots of cover for their invasion of Hungary around the same time, not only crushing a rebellion, but sending a clear message to other satellite states. They gained influence in the Middle East because of their seeming willingness to go to bat for them. The threat also gave the USSR a bit of power and prestige. I mean, if someone's willing to start World War III for you, I guess that means something. It was not the last time Khrushchev would use this tactic, by the way. Maybe that's why we're going to see a lot of videos soon with the name Crisis in them. That is, until Khrushchev did actually almost end the world with this trick in 1962. But spoilers. The alienation from America and the threat of nuclear strike from the Soviet Union also increased tensions across Western Europe. They were no longer entirely sure the United States had their back if things got rough, and so there were calls to try and make a European faction in the Cold War. It was the impetus for France to decide it was time that they pursue their own nuclear weapons program. And given that France is now nearly made of nuclear power plants, that made quite the impact. France basically never forgave the US for the Suez Crisis, and eventually France left the integrated NATO command structure in 1966. but that's yet another thing we're going to wait to get to in future episodes. In the UK, Anthony Eden was not much long for the Prime Minister's job and resigned in disgrace. It's basically the one thing he's known for now. This diplomatic loss accelerated Britain's decolonization efforts to be in a better relationship with the US. Suez could be considered the last big move of the UK as an imperial power, and the sun finally set on the British Empire. But of course, the final victor in all of this was Egypt and Nasser himself. Nasser believed he made a stand against imperial powers and won. Arabs saw him as a hero for their cause of liberation. At the same time, Nasser used the situation to force nearly half of Egyptian Jews to leave the country. Nasser's Suez moment would become the standard for a new faction of the Cold War, the Third World. These were states which would not take sides in the Cold War and often played the superpowers against each other for their own gain, something we'd see all over the world in many different government styles. As the Cold War progresses, and this channel along with it, we'll see these states try to carve their own way in the world with varying levels of success. Some historians, like Vijay Prashad, even argue that if you were to look at the Cold War from the perspective of a third world nation, that the conflict is less of a battle of East and West, but a clash of North and South. And it's hard to disagree with that, as so much of the Cold War would play out as the superpowers vied for influence over nations across the world as they threw off their colonial chains. This is an epic story and really just beginning. We plan at the Cold War to see this conflict from many angles, and the story of the Third World is not one we'll overlook. We hope you've enjoyed today's topic, and to make sure you don't miss future episodes, please make sure you're subscribed to our channel and have a press the bell button. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. We're also active on Facebook and Instagram at The Cold War TV. If you enjoy our work, please consider supporting us via www.patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. This is The Cold War Channel, and don't forget, the trouble with the Cold War is that it doesn't take too long before it becomes heated.